Uhuru comrades, Uhuru, welcome back to the 2022 Party Plenary, the third plenary of the 7th Congress. This is a virtual event and we'll be having virtual vending throughout this program. So next up, this will be your chance to be counted in for the battle to build our own Black power and our own independent economy. Black power economy matters. So let's welcome and support with our money to the Office of the Chairman's Sales.
Uhuru, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, fantastic. It's Ikenga again with the Office of Chairman Amalia Shatella, and I want everybody to, before I even get started, to go to the burningspearmarketplace.com so that you can purchase some of these, what I'm going to show you. We've got dozens of pamphlets that we have produced through the Office of the Chair that we want to share with you. And this one is kind of special to me, which is Forward the Revolutionary African National Democratic Struggle. This is the report that Chairman Amalia Shatella delivered to the MPDUM convention in September 27th and 28th of 2008. And the reason I remember this so well is because this was the first convention of the Uhuru movement that I had attended. And I remember that this is what won me to be where I am today here over 10 years later as a member of the African People's Socialist Party. If you go to theburningspearmarketplace.com, you can purchase this pamphlet for $3. It is a great read. Again, it's the report to the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement Convention that was held in September of 2008, right in St. Petersburg, Florida. So don't miss it, get it. So that's one. Let's see. The next one I have here is Black Community Control of the Police. Black Power in the Black Community's Hands. This was written by Chairman Amalia Shatella in 2015, and it was a report that he delivered to the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations at an April 18th and 19th conference. If you did not attend this conference and you missed the chairman's presentation, here is the opportunity for you to get this. Go to theburningspearmarketplace.com. This particular pamphlet is just $2. Order it today. Theburningspearmarketplace.com. Get this. Let's see what else we've got here. This is just a really fantastic pamphlet, so don't miss the opportunity. Get it today. Oh, another fantastic one is The Ballot and the Bullet. If you want to know anything about how the elections, and especially the 2016 elections, this is when this was written, the Black is Back Coalition, again, in April of 2006, held a conference in Harlem, New York. And this is the chairman's keynote presentation, which we've made into a pamphlet that it's a must read. If you weren't at that convention, I encourage you to go to theburningspearmarketplace.com and purchase The Ballot and the Bullet. Let's see. So I know everyone's going there now and you're purchasing your pamphlets. I want to add that you can not just get one, you can buy a bundle, you can become a distributor through theburningspearmarketplace.com. So go there now, purchase your pamphlets. And let me see, I have another that I want to share with you. This one is entitled Me and the African People's Socialist Party. It is a personal testimony by Abuelita Donaldson. I think it's just incredible that we have this in a pamphlet form that people can read, can understand how Abuelita made her journey to do this revolutionary work. This was a great comrade, is a great comrade, and this is definitely a must read. So go to theburningspearmarketplace.com and get yours today. Again, another fantastic read. Make sure that you get this. And remember, you can become a distributor. You don't have to buy just one. You can buy bundles. We must make sure that we share all of this with the world. So, Uhuru, let's see here. I have another one, and that is The New Period, A Time for Party Building. This is a profound political and historical document that chronicles the courage, difficulties, contradictions, and campaigns and victories of the African People's Socialist Party, led by our chairman, Omali Yeshitela. If you haven't gotten this, you don't know what you're missing. So please go to theburningspearmarketplace.com and order your copy of The New Period, A Time for Party Building. And remember, you don't have to order just one. You can order a bundle and you can also become a distributor of not only our pamphlets and books, but the Burning Spear newspaper. So go to theburningspearmarketplace.com and get your pamphlet today. All of these are must reads. Everyone should have them in their arsenal. We're encouraging everyone. Okay, and they're telling me it's not the burningspearmarketplace.com, it's burningspearmarketplace.com. Burningspearmarketplace.com. Go to burningspearmarketplace.com. You will find there a list of not only these pamphlets that I am sharing with you today, which are absolute must reads. I think you should get one, for a family member, for a friend, and become a distributor. You can distribute all of these pamphlets. You don't have to get just one. You can become a distributor. I hope you can see these. Again, go to burningspearmarketplace.com. Get your pamphlets today. All of these are must read. So I hope you can see everything. And this has been our sales for today for the Office of Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Make sure, again, you support the work of the African People's Socialist Party, the Office of the Chairman, by getting your pamphlets today. Go to burningspearmarketplace.com and get yours today. Uhuru.
Uhuru, comrades, we want to resume our chairman's presentation. So Uhuru, chairman, okay, I believe that's where we're at right now.
Uhuru, thank you very much, Comrade Abdullah. What I'm going to do is resume reading from a rather long excerpt from Hosea Jaffe's A History of Africa. It's something that we're reading to substantiate our position about colonialism being more than simply a policy, but how it is actually a mode of production, and very important for us to understand. But before going into that, I wanted to acknowledge the presence in this meeting of my dear comrades, Kathy and Monica. They are a part of the family of Comrade Ernesto Bustillo, who was the founder of Unión de Barrio and one of the most unrecognized leaders of the anti-colonial movement. He was part of the Mexican National Liberation Movement, a leader in that movement, a genuine communist, and someone who brought the African People's Socialist Party into a relationship with Unión de Barrio that has lasted for more than 35 years up to now. Back to Jaffe. Colonialism as the genesis of Europe and Europeans. Jaffe continues. With the 15th century then, the 15th century then saw the multiplication of the primary accumulation of European capitalism. And Africa played the most important part in the process as the principal arena of European colonialism, the very genesis and foundation of the capitalist system. From the turn of the 16th century, the Americas and Asia were added to this foundation. And out of this totality arose capitalism and modern Europe itself. Before capitalist colonialism, there was no Europe, only a collection of feudal, mercantile, and tribal towns, farms, villages, discrete states and kingdoms vying and warring with each other, just as in Africa, but on a different property basis, that of private property in the land. Europe then was neither a concept nor a reality. At most, a vague idea that Arabs, but not Europeans, had long ago of someplace northwest of Greece. As long as Europe remained isolated from the world, there was no Europe. When it became connected with and dependent on first Africa, then the Americas, and finally Asia, it began to become a reality and an idea. Only when Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Dutch, English, German, Danish, and Swedish confronted and clashed with Africa, America, and Asia, did the need arise for them to consider themselves as a set, a whole, different from, hostile to, and eventually superior to Africans, Aboriginal Americans, and Asians. Colonialism gave them a common interest. This common interest, slaving, plantations, the world market, looting, precious metals, spices, and territory, markets and sources of wealth, was also the source of their conflicts among themselves. From 1500 on, they had already started to quarrel and fight over the colonial booty. In these intra-European conflicts, Portugal and Spain had in time to give away to Holland and France, and these in the 18th century to Britain, while German hidden colonialism, Calvinists, Catholics, and Jews alike steadily garnered what they could of the booty without shedding their blood or losing their own property in the process. The scramble for Africa that led to the 1884-85 Berlin Conference had its roots in 4 centuries of struggle between the European powers for the division of Africa. Colonialism, the basis of European unity, was also the basis of its disunity. Europe was born out of colonialism as the exploiting, oppressing, negating pole that tried to always destroy and assimilate its opposite pole, the rest of the world. The first form was that of primary accumulation from the 14th century to the 19th. The next was that of regular accumulation with an inertial momentum carried forward from the primary accumulation. With capitalism arose Europe, and with Europe, the myth of European civilization, a civilization based on African slavery, American plantations, Asian spices, precious metals from all 3 non-European continents, based too on Indian numerals, Arab algebra, astronomy, and navigation. And Arab Indian took the garment to India from Mombasa, and Chinese gunpowder, paper, and compasses. This non-European civilization was the Narcissus-like admiration of its own conquest. The sword, gunfire, murder, rape, murder, and slavery formed the real material basis for the idea of European superiority. It was out of this process that the very idea of a European man arose, an idea that did not exist even in etymology before the 17th century. Before the slave trade in Africa, there was neither a Europe nor a European. Finally, with the European arose the myth of European superiority and separate existence as a special species or race. There rose indeed the myth of race in general, unknown to mankind before. Even the word did not exist. In general, even the word did not exist before the lingua franca of the Crusades. The particular myth that there was a creature called a European, which implied from the beginning a white man. Colonialism, especially in Africa, created the concept and ideology of race. Before capitalist colonialism, there were no races, but now suddenly and increasingly, there were races. Once born, the myth grew into a reality. Mankind's ignorance about the existence of that European invention, race, was so deep that even as late as 1619, after 2 centuries of slavery, the Portuguese writer Lopez could portray the European and the non-European not as such, but as equal men, dignified and altruistic. But Lopez's view was exceptional. Long before that time, racialism had become an instrument for mass expropriation, slaving, and decimation in Africa, as in Asia and America. Colonialism was always racialist, from soldier to missionary, king to trader, and from the 19th century, from capitalist to socialist. The chronology of the expansion of colonialism in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries is also the chronology of racialism, but it is at the same time a history of struggles between capitalist colonialism and the lost past. Colonialism won this war clearly and thoroughly everywhere, but it could not win by merely destroying the lost past. It had to transform it to assimilate its exploitative non-communal features into capitalism itself, and to reshape the communal features to make them part of the capitalism. The process of transforming the enemy into a part of the victor was long and difficult for Europe. The resistance was never ending. Many African people still say they were conquered and dispossessed, but never defeated and subjected in spirit. Nor was the resistance even and simple. And it is with the complexity of it that we are now concerned. This is from Jose, from Jaffe. This part of the book, Israelite e Africa, is relentless in establishing the basis for our declaration that although clearly some important powers saw a policy of colonialism as a means of their own rapid development, colonialism is more than a policy. It became the mode of production that replaced European feudalism as a mode of production. It was colonialism that transformed the world into a single economic whole, a single political economy within which slaves and masters were destined to pursue the means of producing and reproducing life, each at the expense of the other. White workers and leftists daily share in the feast of colonial loot. As long ago as 1858, in a letter to Karl Marx, his comrade and collaborator Friedrich Engels offered this materialist observation about the ability of white people to unite with their ruling class in the exploitation of the colonial world. Here's the quote: "For a nation which exploits the whole world, this is, of course, to a certain extent justifiable." Later in 1882, in a letter on the same subject, Engels commented to Karl Kautsky, "You ask me what the English workers think about colonial policy. Well, exactly the same as they think about politics in general. The workers gaily share the feasts of England's monopoly of the world market and the colonies," unquote. In Israelite too, we provide evidence that the unacknowledged colonial mode of production plays a major role in the consciousness of the most advanced sector of the white colonial population. It shows the basis for the perennial white opportunism and betrayal in favor of maintaining the place of white people on the pedestal of African exploitation as colonizers. We state, while today white left nationalist opportunism has been forced to acquire a sophisticated articulation of its unity with maintaining the oppression of Africans, the pedestal which white capitalist power requires for its existence. There was a time when it made no attempt to hide its colonialist, which is to say imperialist worldview. At the 1907 Congress of the Second Communist International held in Stuttgart, Germany, which was attended by more than 800 delegates, the majority resolution declared that under a socialist regime, colonialism could be a force for civilization. While many white communists have attributed the reactionary stance of white people, including the white working class, to their being confused or duped by the white bourgeoisie, these excerpts from arguments by prominent communists at the Congress reveal that these advanced representatives of the white working class were quite clear in their colonialist motivation, and that in their view, the benefits of colonialism to the white world did not require the existence of the bourgeoisie. The following also found in Israel to Africa are excerpts of arguments by supporters of the majority position at the Second Communist International. They include statements from Hendrik van Kool from the Netherlands and Edward Bernstein from Germany. Here's Hendrik van Kool from the Netherlands. Quote, "The minority resolution also denies that the productive forces of the colonies can be developed through the capitalist colonial policy. I do not understand at all how a thinking person can say that. Simply consider the colonization of the United States of North America. Without it, the native peoples there would today be living in the most backward social conditions. Does Lederboer want to take away the raw materials indispensable for modern society, which the colonists can offer? Does he want to give up the vast resources of the colonists, even if only for the present? Do those German, French, and Polish delegates who signed the minority resolution want to accept the responsibility for simply abolishing the present colonial system? As long as humanity has existed, there have been colonies, and I think that they will exist for a long time yet. Surely there are few socialists who think that colonies will be unnecessary in the future social order. Although we do not need to discuss this question today, I still ask Lederboer, does he have the courage now under capitalism to give up the colonies? Perhaps he can also tell us what he would do about the overpopulation of Europe. Where would the people who must immigrate go, if not to the colonies? What does Lederboer want to do with the growing production of European industry if he does not want to create new export markets in the colonies? And does he, as a social democrat, want to shirk his duty to work continually for the education and further advancement of the backward peoples, especially for Germany's sake? I regret that the social democracy there has limited itself to questioning the need for colonies from Germany, who is also speaking in support of the majority resolution on socialist colonialism. Here's Bernstein. We must get away from the utopian notion of simply abandoning the colonies. The ultimate consequence of such a view would be to give the United States back to the Indians. Commotion from the audience. The colonies are there. We must come to terms with that. Socialists, too, should acknowledge the need for civilized peoples to act somewhat like guardians of the uncivilized. Lassalle and Marx recognized this. In the third volume of Capital, Marx wrote, the earth does not belong to one people, but to all of humanity. Every people must administer it for the good of humanity. And Lassalle once said, the right of a people to its own development is as little an absolute right as any you will find. It is tied to the condition that there is some development. But people who do not develop may justifiably be subjugated by peoples who have achieved civilization. Our economies are based in large measure on the extraction from the colonies of products that the native people have no idea how to use. Here's Van Cole again. Various comrades have said there is no way to improve the colonial economies. This is false and contradicts the history of colonial policy. Through our socialist activity in the Dutch Parliament, we have achieved significant advances for our colonies. Why should we help only the workers of Europe and not those of other parts of the earth? Arrayed against us in Europe are the mighty forces of capitalism. Why should we not also take up the struggle against capitalism in other countries? Nowhere else could we achieve easier and bigger victories than there. Ledebour said the majority efforts are reactionary. I simply do not understand how he, as a man of science, can fail to recognize that the colonies must first pass through a stage of capitalist development before they can begin to think of socialism there. So we are working for the revolutionary development of the colonies in order to facilitate the transformation of the feudal state into a modern one through capitalism to socialism. A leap from barbarism to socialism is impossible. Very true, an exclamation from the audience. To deny this is not only unscientific, but stupid and short-sighted. Why in God's name should we not be able to raise constructive demands for this development, just as we do for the question of militarism and this tax cut, the tax laws? Kautsky maintains the thesis that colonial policy is conquest, is imperialism. This formula is completely wrong. You should learn better grammar. Today, to be sure, colonial policy is imperialist, but it does not have to be. It can be democratic as well, democratic colonialism. In any case, it is a grave error of Kautsky's to put colonial policy conceptually on par with imperialism. I hope he would see that this is unjustified and that he would strive to make good the error. Kautsky said that we must win the confidence of the native peoples. How does he hope to win the confidence of millions of people of other skin colors if he does nothing for them? Very good, comes a shout from the audience. We in Holland have the duty and right to tell the comrades of other countries about our experiences. We Dutch socialists have gained the confidence of millions of Javanese. But in Africa, the people know nothing about the German social democracy because until now, it has not done its duty. If you want to win the confidence of the native people, then you must actively engage yourself in the colonial question. The learned Kautsky made matters even worse with his advice on how to develop the colonies industrially. We are supposed to take machines and tools to Africa, a theoretical pipe dream. That's supposed to civilize the country. Suppose that we bring a machine to the savages of Central Africa. What will they do with it? Perhaps they will start up a war dance around it, loud laughter, or perhaps by one, the number of their innumerable holy, or increased by one, the number of their innumerable holy idols, laughter. Perhaps we should send some Europeans to run the machines. What the native peoples would do to them, I do not know, but perhaps Kautsky and I will make the attempt. Perhaps theory and practice will then go hand in hand into that savage land with the tools and machines. Perhaps the natives will destroy our machines. Perhaps they would kill us or even eat us. And then I fear that, rubbing his belly, given my superior corporal development, I would have precedence over Kautsky. Laughter. If we Europeans go there with tools and machines, we would be defenseless victims of the native. Therefore, we must go there with weapons in hand, even if Kautsky calls that imperialism. Very true from a part of the hall. So white communists must. This is a really profound thing that we're reading here, because this is from the leading thinking representatives, the so-called communist, socialist, advanced sector of the white world. And there were 800 delegates at this conference in Stuttgart, Germany in 1907. And there were 60,000 people who attended the outdoor rallies that they held. These are white people from all over the world. This is the politic that came from the advanced sector of the white world at that time. So, the point being, of course, that there's an economic basis here. And they want to maintain this pedestal that they continue to suck the blood. And they said explicitly that their position is no different from Trump, Biden, from any other colonizer, Macron, any other colonizer in the world. So white communists must commit to struggle against colonialism under the leadership of the colonized. As we summed up in Iswe Letu Africa about these very explicit and telling quotes from the most prominent white colonizer, leftists and socialists of a century ago. You say, African internationalism will not allow our party to construct some fanciful notion of reality upon which to base the policies of our party. We are materialists, and we base our policies on the world as it actually is, rather than basing our policies on the world as we would like it to be. Those who ignore the real world and base their policies on the notions in their head on the world as they would like it to be are idealists. The fact is that capitalism was born as parasitic white power, and it must be defeated as parasitic white power. Genuine communists of all nationalities must be consciously committed to the overthrow of white power, and white communists must be committed to the struggle for the victory of black power over white power. The beginning of the process of white communists in the US and the world to abandon the interests of imperialism and to integrate their own interests with the interests of the toiling masses of the world is to subordinate their interests to the struggles of the oppressed peoples of the world to overthrow parasitic white power. In the US, this can only be done through joining the anti-colonial struggle for black power. Concretely, this means joining the African People's Solidarity Committee, an organization of and subordinate to the African People's Socialist Party, the advanced detachment of the revolutionary African working class and poor peasantry. So in this political report to the party's third Congress, written more than 30 years ago, we stated that the profound opportunism of white people manifests itself as extreme violence and the near total alienation of white people from the vast majority of the world's peoples. This alienation is expressed in many ways, but none so significantly as the inhumane, barbaric treatment white people have participated in and or encouraged against other peoples, often with the only provocation being the desire of whites to take or keep possession of ill-gotten resources which have become essential to the white way of life. We were able to conclude that the formation of the African People's Solidarity Committee and its ideological and structural relationship to the party were grounded in a firm theoretical basis because of our understanding of colonialism as the mode of production. By the time of our party's sixth Congress in 2013, our theory had developed to the point that we celebrated its meaning as a tool for recapturing the brains of the colonized and for setting world history on a correct course. In my political report to that Congress, I was able to write, our African internationalist theoretical contributions served to break the shackles historically imposed on revolutionary theory as perceived through the lens of oppressor nation intellectuals, colonizers, whose worldviews was determined by their existence on the pedestal of our oppression. African internationalism for the first time allows for Africans and the oppressed of the world to become the subjects of history, defining our own destiny, something not possible with the theory of Marx or his contemporaries and followers. Marx and Engels developed the term mode of production, which according to Marx includes everything that goes into the production of the necessities of life, including the productive forces, labor, instruments, and raw materials, and the relations of production, the social structures that regulate the relation between humans and the production of goods. According to Marx and Engels, for individuals, the mode of production is, quote, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with and what they produce and how they produce. Unquote. It is a combination of the defining relations and forces of production at play within a society. From their viewpoint as European colonizers sitting on the pedestal of African oppression, Marx and Engels erroneously defined various modes of production throughout human history as universal stages of development, supposedly taking all human society from lower to higher level stages. Marx and Engels defined these stages as going from primitive communism to slavery, to feudalism, to capitalism, which they see as progressive development over feudalism, and eventually full-blown communism, apparently given legitimacy by the fact that it has been achieved by Europe, functioning as the template for human development. However, with this formula, the movement from European feudalism to world capitalism continued to be a mystery, despite the efforts by Marx to resolve this with his definition of primitive accumulation, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins that signal the rosy dawn of capitalist production. Marx said more about this, but it all boils down to the fact that it was colonialism that developed an impoverished, disease-ridden Europe out of feudalism, and that the feudal mode of production with its specific features was replaced by the colonial mode of production with specific features revolving around the parasitic extraction of value of human and material resources from the colonized to European colonizers. And this is what we've just talked about coming from Hosea Jaffe a moment ago. A January 1990 presentation I made to a conference sponsored by our party in St. Petersburg, Florida, represented another occasion where the question of theoretical implication of colonialism as a global phenomenon was addressed to a mass audience of African people. In addition to Africans from throughout the US and some members of the American Indian movement, AIM, participants included representatives from movements from Guyana, South America, the Gambia, West Africa, and Tanzania, commonly known as South Africa. The conference was titled Freedom Weekend and was designed to address the issue of heightened counterinsurgency war being made against our movement. Here's an excerpt from that presentation. And in explaining the emergence of capitalism in human history, Marx defined the relationships that people who got paid for their labor had with the bourgeoisie as wage slavery. He said that wage slavery in Europe needed as a precondition slavery pure and simple in the New World. To us, that meant clear that the fundamental contradiction in the world is not the contradiction that occurred between white workers and their bosses. Rather, it was the contradiction that existed between slavery pure and simple, the pedestal, and wage slavery, or the capitalist production, and all the capitalist relationships that rested on this pedestal of slavery. We have said all along that the class question is concentrated in the colonial question. This is the only explanation of why the European Revolution has never happened. Even the existence of what they call the Soviet Union had to be explained by Lenin in retrospect. Before the Russian Revolution, all the communists throughout Europe, and even the Bolsheviks, had said that socialist revolution would happen in Western Europe first. They believed that the revolution in Russia was to get rid of the Tsar, to overthrow feudalism. Since according to their theory, feudalism led to capitalism, it would have to be a revolution ushering in capitalism. Even after the February Revolution in 1917, most of the Bolsheviks refused to try to make a socialist revolution because it defied everything they said was supposed to happen. What then is the historical basis for the rise of socialism? The historical basis for the rise of socialism is the destruction of the pedestal upon which the whole capitalist edifice rests. The historical basis for the rise of socialism is a revolutionary activity throughout Africa and among the African communities in the US, throughout Asia and Latin America. This ongoing process, becoming deeper with every go around, is what has been consistently undermining capitalism and imperialism, and therefore bringing us closer to a period where socialist revolution on the world scale is finally a real possibility. African people produce, reproduce real life for white people. My book, An Uneasy Equilibrium, the political report to the party's 6th Congress, was one of our most definitive statements providing the basis for my conclusion that colonialism was a mode of production moving Europe out of feudal destitution and despair. This same process created the conditions for the development of both the European bourgeoisie and working class from the same fabric that rise to the fundamental unity of opposites of the colonizer and colonized that constitutes a mode of production. I stated a party and movement were forced to conclude that all humans, including Europeans, are trapped by an absolute necessity to secure and develop the means of subsistence. In other words, the primary motivating force in human society is the production and reproduction of life. Without life, all other questions, religion, culture, genetics, etc., are moot, meaningless. Indeed, culture is a byproduct of the process of producing and reproducing life. However, the process of Africans producing and reproducing life was drastically disrupted and altered by the European attack that resulted in the capture and colonial enslavement of Africa and Africans. This attack by Europeans on Africa also resulted in the imposition of artificial borders that separate the dispersed African nation from our human and material resources and from a meaningful relationship among ourselves and with the peoples of the world. The material and human resources of Africa have gone to satisfy the requirements of life for Europeans at the expense of Africa and Africans. The process of Africans producing and reproducing life has not been primarily for Africa and Africans. It has been primarily for Europe and the white world at our expense. This progenitor of world capitalism, the attack on Africa and Africans, along with the European assault on Asia and the Americas, rescued Europe and Europeans from an oppressive 1,000-year-long disease-ridden, impoverished existence known as feudalism. This was the genesis of the capitalist system as a world economy created on a base of the enslavement of Africans and others. A scientific analysis of human society requires that we take a dialectical approach. We cannot see the world as static and ready-made. Society has to be analyzed as a process that is in a constant state of motion, change, and development. There's always something new arising to replace the old, and all social motion occurs in relationship to this process of coming into existence and dying away. Europe's attack on Africa was effectively an assault on Africa's ability to produce life for itself. This assault has had the effect of pushing Africa and Africans out of history. Slavery, genocide, and colonialism are the stuff of which capitalism was born. African enslavement was the first capital in the development of capitalism. The prevailing legal system, culture, religion, and general philosophical outlook or worldview constitute the superstructure of capitalism thus conceived. This superstructure is a natural product and reflection of this economic base of colonial slavery. Slavery and colonialism gave rise not only to capitalism, but also to the capitalists and working classes alike of Europe and North America. The workers and the bourgeoisie, the two primary the primary capitalist defining classes, have occasionally fought great battles with each other since their inception as contending social forces. Nevertheless, both were born and developed on a platform of slavery and colonialism. Consequently, what is often called class struggle inside the US and Europe is actually contention among the workers and the ruling class for control of the parasitic capitalist pedestal and its stolen resources. Yeah, one is tempted to just, say again that this really offers a better understanding of what happened on January 6th in the United States of last year, when a sector of the settler colonial population attacked the U.S. Capitol it is contention among the workers and the ruling class for control of the parasitic capitalist pedestal and its stolen resources. The parasitic foundation of world capitalism continues to exist up to now as a true economic base upon which the entire superstructure of the capitalist-defined, capitalist-dominated world rests. The total existence of white people and their ability to produce and reproduce life is dependent on this parasitic relationship that came into being with the attack by feudal Europe on Africa and the world. Instead of separate, more or less self-contained worlds existing in casual relationship to each other, there's now one capitalist world system, united by a parasitic economic relationship imposed by Europe upon the rest of us. There is therefore no European reality separate from that of Africa and the rest of the world. The entire world is now locked into a single dialectical process, a unity of opposites, where upon the gruesome extraction of life and resources from Africa and the rest of the world is a condition for the life and development of what we now know as Europe, or white people, and the capitalist system to which we have been forcibly affixed. The legal system, culture, white sense of sameness, and political institutions are reflections of this parasitic economic state base. Every white aspiration and dream, every expectation for happiness and a good life, from a successful marriage to a secure future for their children, requires drone strikes in Pakistan, police murders and mass imprisonment of the African colonies and barrios in the United States, and starvation and forced displacement of the oppressed throughout the world. This, comrade, is a mode of production that rescued Europe at our expense and is generally defined as human progress when viewed through the lenses of European intellectuals, including the Marxist colonial who love us. Bourgeois class-informed confusion around the fact that colonialism is a mode of production has been a primary contributor to the stalemate faced by revolutionaries up to this date. Lack of clarity on this crucial point led to the erroneous conclusion that success in the struggle within a single country can possibly bring socialism or communism into existence. Only African internationalism explains the existing social system as a product of colonialism. It is a system that requires colonialism as a pedestal and that cannot exist without colonialism. It constitutes a colonial mode of production enveloping the world. All the political movements, communist, fascism, etc., occur within this colonial mode of production. Only African internationalism targets the global colonial mode of production and not just some expression of exploitation and oppression that it produces. This is a fundamental philosophical contradiction that has bedeviled revolutionary theoreticians since the nominal end of colonialism. It is something that has and always will distinguish the party's trajectory from other organizations. Essentially, the fact is that most of the world sees national liberation resulting as entry into the existing international order. Now I can go to the United Nations, I can be a part of WTO, I can, all this kind of stuff. This is due to not recognizing the colonial mode of production as the existing international order. It's like integrating into the oppressor. Recognition of the colonial mode of production forces us to struggle to defeat the existing international order, not integrate into it. This philosophy of integration is analogous to the politics of liberal groups, colonized and colonizer acknowledged. This philosophy of integration is analogous to the politics of liberal groups, colonized and colonizers, acknowledged liberals and those posing as communists, incorrectly requiring Africans and other colonial subjects to fight for integration into the system as a way of overturning capitalism and African oppression. In fact, there are some who characterize themselves as revolutionary integrationists. The anti-colonial movement came into existence as part of the existing international order, born of the colonial mode of production. Consequently, its general understanding of the world is influenced by this economic base and its superstructure stemming from the colonial mode of production. Moreover, the colonial mode of production serves the interests of the global colonialist ruling class, defined by the superstructure that brought it into existence, including the ideas and institutions that formulate them. Such a ruling class is not about to define itself out of existence. One reason the colonizer has not been able to recognize his significance as stemming from colonialism. Hence, the world has been trapped on an ideological and political treadmill, the gerbil running wheel. Regardless of the speed and intensity of the motion, we never get to our desired destination. Only African internationalism will get us there. So we're looking at chapter 3 in the crisis of imperialism, which is important for us to understand. This entire political report to members of our party, our movement, and to other comrades who are attending this really wants to make the point that what we are experiencing is not just what we call segregation or racism or police violence. We're not just experiencing a phenomenon, or we shouldn't experience them as just incidents. That we're living in a social system that came into existence through the colonial enslavement of Africa and the colonization of peoples around the world. Vast majority of the people on earth are starving. The vast majority of people on earth don't have clean water, don't have electricity, and what have you. And so this is what we're looking at. So we really celebrate when a system based like this is in crisis. Our objective has to be to bring this thing down. And so here in chapter 3, we talk about the crisis of this system, the crisis of imperialism. As I wrote in my political report to the Sixth Party Congress, today there is an uneasy equilibrium between the past and the future, and much anxiety abounds throughout the world. Every individual, every social force that perceives its future attached to the existing imperialist social system is experiencing severe distress. And sometimes these are people who are in the so-called revolutionary movement, sometimes even people in the party, because there's a way that people get a stake in the existing social system. They can't turn it loose. They can't, I'm talking about ordinary folk. Now I'm talking about people who have chosen the mantle of revolutionary and come into revolutionary organization and discipline. And so they find themselves protecting the system in various ways. I call the party of the Sixth Congress the metaphorical mountaintop from which we can see the future of our Africa and our people, liberated and united, propelling and all oppressed humanity, all the workers and toiling masses of the world into a future of peace, prosperity, and eternal social justice. Since our party's first Congress in 1981, I've always summed up the deepening crisis of imperialism in every political report. Our party has relentlessly worked to deepen imperialism's crisis with every passing year over the past half century as we tirelessly pursued African redemption and self-government. We are reminded here that we are not having a new discussion. We are only discussing how the crisis of imperialism reveals itself to us at this moment, a snapshot in rapidly evolving history. Indeed, this is one of the roles of our plenary. They help us to sum up where we are in our 5-year plan provided by our Congress. Where are we in carrying out our mandates and resolutions? How is our work affected by evolving circumstances that make building our party ever more urgent? Our party's African internationalism recognizes the existence of this permanent crisis the party's regional strategy and ongoing work to occupy all the political space within the African world provide the colonized of the earth the ability to strike out against colonialism in a coordinated way from a single center. The US, a troubled hegemon, faces existential crisis from an assortment of contradictions. Even the continuation of US economic quarantine of Afghanistan, with its starvation from afar and slander, cannot erase from public consciousness the humiliating defeat of the mighty US by impoverished anti-colonial Afghani fighters. US has also been unable to overturn the Iranian Republic or return that country to the vassalist state it initiated there after overthrowing its elected leader in 1953. Nor has the US been able to consolidate power in Iraq as part of the grand narcissistic scheme to transform the Middle East into some version of Euro-American society. Russian intervention in Syria has assisted the government there in resisting US efforts of regime change. Turkey, with its own regional grand scheme, has become emboldened by obvious US weaknesses and is attempting to chart its own course that would challenge US hegemony by fighting for Turkish regional hegemony. Libya, Lebanon, Egypt, Pakistan, ad infinitum, are just some of the obvious places where the US is clearly losing its footing. The vicious white nationalist settler state of Israel, a military outpost and strategic asset of the US, cannot squelch the anti-colonial struggles of the Palestinian people to take back their land and evict the colonial interlopers. The legion of other enemies of Israeli settler state can predict Israel's demise despite all the nefarious intrigue, cyber, and other military attacks included, being deployed by Israel in the region and beyond. Everything is in a state of play. The uneasy equilibrium between the past and the future that I described years ago. The US has lost its place as the global political center of gravity. The times are gone when US economic power and military superiority served to hold things together and maintain order within the colonial mode of production throughout the world. The Munich Security Conference, convening annually in Germany, is a major colonial capitalist institution that most Africans are not familiar with. Its online journal described its 2020 meeting in a manner that reflects the growing consciousness of imperialist crisis by the global ruling class, the global ruling elite. Some imperialist pundits among them have coined the term. This is from the global elite, that they've coined the term westlessness to describe the diminishing power of the colonizers and the growing shakiness of the colonial mode of production. This is an excerpt from the Munich Security Conference Journal that reveals a global colonial capitalist ruling class meeting that is much less confident of the future than this, our plenary. At the Munich Security Conference 2020, held from February 14 to 16, hundreds of senior leaders and thinkers from politics, international organizations, business, and civil society gathered to discuss preeminent crises and future security challenges around the world. A focal at that conference was the role of the Western Alliance, liberal values, and multilateralism in the current geopolitical landscape. The Munich Security Conference, MSC 2020, welcomed numerous high-ranking international decision makers, including more than 30 heads of government and heads of state, as well as nearly 100 cabinet ministers. Among the participants were French President Emmanuel Macron, German Minister of Defense Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs Wang Yi, Managing Director of International Monetary Fund Kristalina Georgieva, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs Josep Borrell, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Patricia Espinosa Castellano, and Facebook founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg. This is the meeting that they're having. We're having this plenary, and the meeting that we're talking about. This is every year. These colonial powers, they come up with the concept of Westlessness. When they say West, they're not just speaking in geographical terms, because they include, for example, New Zealand, Australia. They're talking about white people who have been part of the colonizer nation. And so this is what they are fretting. And of course, what they do is they present their positions in the world, as liberal values and fighting for a liberal world order. They talk about law-based societies and things like order that they're fighting for. That's how they characterize themselves. So this is what they are concerned about. All of this stuff is seems to be being flushed down the toilet. So here's what they say. Discussions about the state of the West, which is the white colonizer. At the heart of this year's conference was the state of the West and a widespread perception of Westlessness. The term coined by the Munich Security Report 2020 refers to a divided and some parts increasingly illiberal West that seems to be retreating from the global stage. It ain't retreating, it's been pushed off. And I just think that this is really important because they're talking about a widespread perception. And look at who's there. They got people of heads of government, people with cabinet members. They got people like Zuckerberg, Facebook, the guy that gives us so much hell is giving us hell in part because they see themselves as disappearing, and what they want to do is control the ability of the world to recognize what is happening by protecting their status as the West, as the colonizer, so to speak. So while the term pervaded debates in Munich, that is Westlessness, the term pervaded debates in Munich, differences quickly emerged. Most importantly, the state of the West and the extent of its crises were assessed differently on both sides of the Atlantic. While the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo claimed that Western liberal values were winning and relegated transatlantic disagreements to the level of tactics, his European counterparts seemed much more concerned. They voiced disquiet about the state of Western unity, and like French President Emmanuel Macron, attested a growing inability of the West to shape the international order in line with its values. And it's really important. I mean, you talk about Macron concerned about being able to shape the international order in line with the values of the West. Here's Macron, who is the president of France. And France, up to now, controls like the economy of something like 14 different artificially created states in Africa. It takes 65% annually of their foreign reserves. And then it takes that without them even knowing how much it is. And then they take it and then they charge the states from whom they take it for the price of keeping it for them. So they not only have, we not only give up our resources or have them taken from France, we pay France extra for doing that. And if we raise questions about it, France overthrows us. Look at Gbagbo. By no means a revolutionary in Ivory Coast, but he had the audacity to challenge that. And France right now is fighting all kinds of wars in Africa, especially in that part of places like Chad and Mali, et cetera. So it's a real serious thing. And so they are concerned about Westlessness and their values. So while US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo claimed the Western liberal values were winning and relegated transatlantic disagreements to the level of tactics, his European counterparts seemed much more concerned. They voiced disquiet about the state of Western unity, and like French President Emmanuel Macron attested a growing inability of the West to shape the international order in line with its values. And see, when we talk about they're concerned about Western unity, Macron, we've already talked about how, and early on, that colonialism was the basis not only for the unity of the colonizer of Europe, but also its disunity. And this is effectively what they fight for and fight around in every instance, is who's going to get what from the resources of Africa and other colonized countries, and what is, and depending on what they think is their strength of their hand at any given moment, they will betray their white colonial partners at the drop of a hat. And this is what we see with the desperation of the social system now, based on the fact that people everywhere are fighting to take back our resources, and victories by people in Venezuela and Afghanistan and other places show how, and even Syria, the inability to overthrow the Iraqi government, the inability of turning Iran and what they want it to be. This is over a period of time. It is something that the people experience as everywhere, as demonstrative of the weakness of U.S. imperialism in particular. And then, of course, you've got China and Russia successfully contesting with the U.S. at the same time. It's a hell of a situation they confronted with. So, by contrast, the size of the Chinese threat to the Western community was perceived as much more pronounced by U.S. representatives than by their European peers. So that's the quote. So the most obvious contradiction facing the U.S. And the colonial powers of Europe is the rise of China, that is eclipsing Europe within the existing colonial mode of production that once also held China in its thrall. Discussions are taking place within leading bourgeois colonial journals about the likelihood of direct military confrontation between the US and China, based on assumptions that historically major powers such as the US have always resorted to arms when necessary to curtail the rise of serious contenders. Now China is a major player, the barely disputed leading economy that is making such rapid inroads to previously held US spheres of influence that the US government and media commonly refer to China as an adversary, with its growth of power and influence among the primary, being the primary determinant for such a characterization. Consequently, the US is deploying anti-China war games and provocative intrusion in the Asia-Pacific region with the unconcealed intent of power projections to protect the existing global political and economic configuration and to deter China and intimidate any country that might seek in China a different imperial patron. China is a country that initially broke free from the colonial mode of production with its revolution in 1949. Under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party initiated a bold revolutionary struggle that became a model for colonized people worldwide. Mao broke from what was generally characterized as Marxism, and using the dialectical and historical materialist method of investigation and analysis that was developed by Marx and others, created an approach to revolution based on Marxism or communism with Chinese characteristics. That would be called Mao Zedong thought. The Chinese Revolution changed the way in which Chinese were able to view themselves and forced the world to see China differently as true accomplices of history that stunted the growth of colonial capitalism in Asia. Not only did the Chinese Communist Party unite the Chinese nation, it played a significant role in pushing back US colonial military aggression in Korea, fighting it to a standstill shortly after China's successful revolution and deterring total US domination of Asia. Much has changed since that time, and China has joined the colonial mode of production on its own terms. But the fact remains that China continues to be a growing bone in the throat of US colonial capitalism, despite the apparent rapprochement that occurred during the US President Richard Milhouse Nixon's regime, that the US thought had defanged China and turned it into an inert, opulent object of exploitation. Unlike many other countries the US was dealing with throughout the world, China was not an inert neo-colony. It had won its independence through a revolutionary struggle under the leadership of a revolutionary party. Although hobbled by the global colonial mode of production, China had initiated a post-revolutionary independent path of development that made it less vulnerable to US and other colonialist economic penetration and political blandishments. Along with China, Russia is a bone in the throat of US imperialism. Russia is another country that has fractured the global hegemony of the US. Shortly after the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, the US and other European colonial powers confidently assumed Russia and China would be transformed into satellites within the colonial mode of production under US authority. They did not understand either country or the historical process that gave rise to their current iterations. All the other European countries had come into existence through colonialism. It was colonialism that pulled them out of the feudal mode of production and into prosperous capitalism resting on our enslavement. Not true of Russia. Russia was a semi-feudal country that entered into a semblance of modernity through its revolution in 1917. It was the Russian Revolution in which socialists came to power that now allowed the limited development of Russia, not colonialism. Russia has also set out on an independent path, refusing to concede to US domination. It has projected its power in the Middle East on the side of US strategic opponents like the governments of Syria and Iran, and established relations with other sometimes contradictory Middle Eastern states that provide them some leverage in their negotiations with the US and Israel. Additionally, Russia continues to fight the encroachment of NATO, a projection of US military state power into the traditional spheres of interest of the former Soviet Union. In 2014, a US-influenced coup overthrew the government of Ukraine after it refused to break with Russia and become a vassal of Europe and the US, to the chagrin of the colonial powers. This intervention did not go unanswered by Russia, that supported the referendum in Crimea, Ukraine, mandating the separation of Crimea from the coup makers. Russia has also supported the armed struggle against the coup that it continues in Ukraine up to now. Not only did this put another damper on US moves for domination of the world, but it is one of the factors that expose the limitation of US military power, historically used to cow peoples and governments into submission. The US and its proxies in the European Union, England, and other arenas are engaging in heated propaganda assaults against Russia that are accompanied by threatening US nuclear-capable military flyovers of Russian border areas. There have also been attacks on Russian military forces supporting the Syrian government by Israel, a significant US military outpost. And as we know, this struggle continues to escalate. But people need to understand what is going on, the history of this process. There's a discussion about Russian military border buildup on its border with Ukraine, and how this represents a terrible threat to Ukraine by Russians. But there is no acknowledgement of the history that took us to this place, how the US overthrew, participated in facilitating the overthrow of a government in Ukraine that was friendly to the Soviet Union. Nor does it talk about the history of this relationship between Ukraine and Russia, how much of Russian identity comes from this place they call Ukraine, how the Russian people fought and gave tremendous, when the Soviet Union existed, gave tremendous amounts of resources to what is now called Ukraine, to build it into what it is. And now the US moving to maintain the encirclement of Russia. And you have to remember that they're using NATO here too. And NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was something that came into existence to deal with the Soviet Union, or Soviet Russia as it used to be called. And so this is an ongoing aggression. It did not just start, it's been going on for a while, but the US government relies on the ignorance of the people in this country and much of the world that's facilitated by people like Zuckerberg, who's concerned about Westlessness occurring. In December of 2021, US President Joseph Biden convened a meeting with more than 100 countries that was defined as a summit of democracies. It was not important that the US would be hard pressed to justify these invitees as democracies, even by US definition. The real arrogance of this sham summit is the fact that it was a summit that would be called and hosted by the US, with its very existence as a settler state, existing on stolen land of a people still ensconced in concentration camps referred to as Indian reservations. The economy of the US was irrefutably developed by the stolen labor of Africans and other colonized peoples within the US prisons of nations. The term America is derived from the name of a European whose only connection to the land is through the legacy of European colonialism. So the US has initiated what might be called a Cold War with China and Russia as its main targets, by casting as main opposing antagonists democracies versus autocracies. Of course, the US and its minions are democracies in China, Russia, and any other force in active opposition to US machinations are characterized as autocracies. The fact that Russia makes no pretense of being a socialist or communist state only serves to illustrate that the so-called Cold War between Russia and Chinese communism versus US and Western capitalism in the past served the same purpose as Biden's democracy gambit to protect a shaky colonial mode of production today. During the so-called Cold War, the colonial powers of the West were engaged in every effort to protect the global mode of production that they foresaw experiencing a domino effect of colonial losses due to intervention by communist Russia and China that were never incorporated into the colonial mode of production. Members of the African People's Socialist Party and our movement are not bamboozled by the nonsense of democracies versus autocracies. We are quite clear that democracies and autocracies are merely forms of the state, and that it would be near lunacy to engage in struggle based on these characterizations. But this is also a matter of smoke and mirrors politics that attempts to take advantage of the fact that most people do not recognize that democracy and autocracy are themselves form of the state that works in the interests of the ruling class, the state that is an organ of coercion. The US characterizes the form of the state. The US characterization of the form of the state does not define the content of the society it governs. Ancient Greece is held up as the epitome of democracy by the colonial capitalist ruling class, although 80% of the population of ancient Greece was enslaved. It is similar to the often used term fascism, given to intra-colonial crisis when capitalism reveals itself in its nakedness, its colonial birthday suit, so to speak. In such cases, the colonizers find it necessary to protect the notion of capitalism as essentially democratic, something even communist colonizers are also guilty of. Like the term autocracy, as used by Biden, the term fascism is an attempt to obscure the very nature of the system by defining it according to the forms of the state used to protect and advance its interests. And I think it's really important because this characterization of fascism being an anomaly is a suggestion that capitalism works in the interest of the people otherwise. And what fascism is, of course, stated simply, is when the dictatorship of the colonial capitalist system that Africans and oppressed peoples around the world that's being experienced by the Venezuelan people, being experienced by the Chinese, being experienced by police shooting down Africans throughout the United States, being experienced by people living under French colonial domination. When this form of the state, when this dictatorship of the colonial capitalist state begins to intrude, appear to intrude, or threatens to intrude into the life of ordinary white people, that's the crisis that makes it necessary to say something about what's happening to white people and characterize it as fascism. In so doing, there are a lot of contradictions associated with that, but one really important contradiction is that they give a left-hand nod to something positive about capitalism, that somehow capitalism is cool, except when it happens to white people, when it expresses itself the way it was born. It was born through subjugation for a total assault on democracy and the rights of the majority of the people of the world. That's what capitalism is. So to say that some fascism is happening because of some contradiction between white people who live on the pedestal of oppression and everybody else is just nonsense. But anyway, this is where Biden is trying to go. So a democracy or an autocracy does not determine the essence of a society. Otherwise, the colonial capitalist U.S. or the virulently murderous and anti-democratic white nationalist settler state of Israel could not be considered for discussion. The issue continues to be democracy for whom? A colonial mode of production is defined essentially by the fact that the democracy of the colonizer comes at the expense of democracy for the colonized. For the colonized, self-determination, a colonialist negating existence is what democracy looks like, whether the colonizer society itself is under democratic or fascist rule. Biden's farcical summit, coming in the wake of millions of African-led protests and uprising within the US and white settler-initiated coup attempts against the white settler colonial government a year ago, is a poor attempt to cover the existential crisis the US is currently experiencing, and to mobilize whatever possible fraying support, domestic or internationally, to the side of the traditional democratic colonizer states led by the US. Biden will not be able to explain his way out of the existential crisis the colonial capitalist system is experiencing, with empty slogans and campaigns that require the disorganized acquiescence of the colonized for their success. Our party is determined to expose the nature of the contradiction by relentlessly forwarding the struggle against colonial capitalism, by building our party and escalating the struggle for African liberation and redemption. The historic people of Cuba, the heroic people of Cuba and South America, including Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Colombia, among others, are not lulled into some kind of acquiescence by Biden's democracy mumbo jumbo. Haiti is not the only Caribbean country that cannot be immobilized in our fight for total liberation by Biden's blandishment. The struggle goes on relentlessly. The most important thing for us to understand, even as we recognize all the clear signs of irreversible US hegemonic decline, is that all the struggles we are witnessing and experiencing are occurring on the foundation of colonial capitalism. There are struggles that are in some ways similar to the January 6th attempted coup by settlers in the US. They are struggles occurring on a foundation of colonialism. They are struggles that are inherently opposed. They are not struggles that are inherently opposed to the colonial mode of production, except in the sense that they contribute to the deepening crisis, the quantitative changes that will facilitate the great qualitative leap to revolutionary transformation we were founded 50 years ago to accomplish. We point out the despairing words of imperialist pundits. A year ago, we spoke about this crisis in our political report to the Second Congress, to the Second Plenary, using the despairing words of thinking representatives of the colonial capitalist ruling class that also reveal the way the US colonial capitalists are defining themselves and what they see as their primary opponents. The July-August 2020 edition of the bourgeois journal Foreign Affairs is dedicated to this discussion. One joint submission by Alexander Cooley and Daniel H. Nexon has the revealing title, how hegemony ends, the unraveling of American power. A vicious cycle that erodes US power has replaced the virtuous cycle that once reinforced it. With the rise of great powers such as China and Russia, autocratic and illiberal projects rival the US-led liberal international system. Developing countries, and even many developed ones, can seek alternative patrons rather than remain dependent on Western largesse and support. And illiberal, often right-wing transnational networks are pressing against the norms and pieties of the liberal international order that once seemed so implacable. In short, US global leadership is not simply in retreat, it is unraveling, and the decline is not cyclical, but permanent. So imperialism is experiencing obvious disarray. Last year's political report to the party's second plenary of our 7th Congress made the basic points to be understood by the party concerning the dying but not yet dead colonial capitalist system. When we quoted extensively from the previous political report from 2020, we are quoting that same again as a reminder that our understanding of this period are fundamentally the same. The following excerpt still correctly describes the worsening crisis of imperialism that continues to contextualize our revolutionary work. It represents an example of the urgency associated with the 2020 plenary theme, Vanguard Up, and the class-based confusion of Fukuyama and other thinking representatives of colonial capitalism. So here we're saying as imperialism is experiencing obvious disarray. The international bourgeoisie is split in 1,000 different ways. Regarding wars and raging wars and threats of war continue unabated. Traditional bourgeois alliances are under severe stress due to the growing competition between parasitic international thieves for shrinking access to the colonial resources. They're fighting over resources violently extracted at the expense of our lives and freedoms, and totally necessary for the continued success of the global capitalist system. And I'm just reminded again that 1907 Stuttgart conference where, even the large communist movement was one with that. The economic configuration of the world is undergoing transformation at this very moment. Trade wars between China and the US, the Brexit crisis that has paralyzed England politically and disrupted strategic assumptions of capitalist development in Europe and the world. The growing split between the wealthy North and poorer South threatens the future of Spain. The disruptive emergence of an energized, if economically challenged Russia, contesting US hegemony in the Middle East and upsetting the balance of power in Europe, balance of forces in Europe and elsewhere. The audacious China that sometimes aligned with Russia is increasingly willing to openly contend with the US. These are just a few of the examples of imperialism experiencing existential crisis. There are others: Korea, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, most of the Americas. Often uninformed and poorly led battles are raging across the African continent. This is complicated by the contest for economic and political advantage between China, the US, and former European colonizers. This is a contest that does not have the advantage of a fully developed, coherent African internationalist, informed and organized effort by Africans to conquer power in our own name and in our own interest. Excuse me. Wow. The US is the headquarters of a dying imperialism as we have known it for the past 70 years at least. It is the center of the storm, wreaking havoc with imperialist unity internationally, in part because of domestic imperialist disunity. So climate, the crisis is caused by colonial mode of production. In addition to the geopolitical crisis of imperialism due to the resistance of the colonized, the colonial mode of production is responsible for a climate crisis that is serious beyond most belief. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has been in nearly 4.5 million years. Millions of years before the appearance of almost all life on Earth. The last time the world was this hot was 125,000 years ago. The massive amounts of carbon dioxide get trapped in the atmosphere surrounding the Earth and causes the Earth to get hotter and hotter like greenhouse. I saw an interview on some news channel today. I think this guy's Bezos was talking about how within a relatively short period of time, there are going to be all kinds of spatial flights and by all kinds of people, and that they're looking to build centers in various places and to inhabit other planets. And he says something to the effect that it's going to be increasingly difficult to live on the Earth. And so they're making plans to get off. And they didn't say anything about y'all, the rest of us, but yeah, that's extraordinary. The last time the world was this hot was 125,000 years ago. The massive amounts of carbon dioxide gets trapped in the atmosphere surrounding the Earth and causes the Earth to get hotter and hotter like a greenhouse. This heat is rapidly melting the ice in the Arctic and Antarctic that for hundreds of thousands of years has remained frozen all year round. In 2021, temperatures in the Arctic Circle reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time ever recorded. In fact, the polar regions are heating up faster than any other part of the planet. The permanent ice cover reflected the sun's rays away from the Earth and served as the planet's air conditioner. With the ice gone, more blue ocean is now exposed and the water soaks up the sun's rays, heating the oceans. This process is rapidly killing plants and sea life, creating sea level rise that will soon drown cities on coasts, along with producing massive droughts and killer storms with wind strength never seen before, increased earthquakes and volcanic activity, along with a rise of heat and humidity that in some places is approaching temperatures greater than 120 degrees on a regular basis. Already 200 species a day are going extinct, something that scientists call the sixth mass extinction, the last one being when all the dinosaurs abruptly died. There was not mention of mass extinction when scores of millions of Africans and indigenous people were wiped out by European slaughter. The major cause of this global warming from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is emissions from cars, planes, factories, part and parcel of the colonial mode of production built on slavery, genocide, plunder, and rape. All of the climate conferences, so-called climate agreements, and imperialist demonstrations are meaningless manifestations of white opportunist idealism. Imperialism caused the climate crisis from its very inception with the assault on Africa and killing African people beginning in the 1400s. Oil and natural gas, the two greatest polluters on the planet, are the two most lucrative commodities of colonial capitalism. The interests of oil and gas are one with the US state, with the largest, most deadly military on earth, and the colonial interests of the entire US political and economic system. These commodities are the basis for US wars throughout the Middle East and conquest in Africa, the US and Asia. Oil and gas are tied to the white colonial prosperity and way of life. I want to mention acknowledgement of the fact that technology is moving intruding into things like petroleum use and cars and other things like that, as more and more industry is using what they like to refer to as clean energy. But don't believe it, because even what they call clean energy is stuff that requires lithium that's stolen from parts of South America, holes being dug there. It requires all kinds of cobalt and coltan and everything coming from Africa. We're going to see an escalation of war. Even things like wind farms require that kind of expropriation of resources from Africa. And it's again an attempt by the white people who love us to rescue themselves at the expense of the colonizers, even when they use terms like colonialism, and that they're going to find a good way to pay the colonized for all of the stuff that they're doing to us, et cetera. It's the same old story. So clearly, the real issue is colonial capitalism, not the climate. European imperialism created and maintains this situation in one long trajectory that began when the first white person got off the boat in Africa, captured an African person, forced her onto a ship to steal her genius, her labor, and her land and resources. While white climate scientists fear loss of habitats, for human beings, the fact is, as we have pointed out, the habitats of African indigenous people have long been destroyed by Europe's colonial assault on our people for 600 years in the process of creating the habitat and production and reproduction of life for white people. Nothing will change the climate crisis short of total destruction of the colonial mode of production. And only the African working class in the form of the African People's Socialist Party can do that. Nothing makes the point better than the assumption by some climatologists that the Little Ice Age, as they called it, of the 16th century, was caused by rapid European slaughter of millions of indigenous people in the Americas during the century following Columbus's so-called discovery of the New World. This massive genocide halted farming and village life, destroying human habitats that resulted in massive encroachment of forests and a consequent decrease of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that cooled the planet. This colonial assault on the climate resulted in the extermination of an estimated 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas, from an estimated 60.5 million people in 1496 to only 6 million by 1600. The climate crisis being experienced and discussed by frantic colonial academics and environmentalists today is a crisis that began with the intrusion of the white man, the colonizer, that created the colonial mode of production that is now pushing into the lives of the colonizer with greater intensity. The recent recognition of the impact colonial destruction had on what is now called the Americas, precisely because of this colonialism, does not even consider the impact of the colonial attack on Africa. And we got to remember, this attack started much earlier than Columbus is coming to the Americas. We're talking about something that started in 1400. So the recent recognition of the impact colonial destruction had on what is now called the Americas, precisely because of this colonialism, does not even consider the impact of the colonial attack on Africa that destroyed lives and human habitats in Africa, at least equal to that of the Americas. Entire cities were destroyed or evacuated by Africans fleeing capture by colonial slavers, just as in the Americas, these parts of Africa were left to the forest, something that also contributed to carbon dioxide reduction that cooled the earth in the first centuries of Europe's onslaught on Africans and those who today continue to struggle under the yoke of the violence of the colonial mode of production. The changing climate is one of the many fronts of imperialist crisis being pushed to the surface by a social system, a mode of production driven by profit above all else. The climate catastrophe and the COVID pandemic are among the combination of factors undermining the colonial capitalist production process that has already experienced an altered planetary configuration nearly as pronounced as the Earth's wobble on its axis caused by melting glaciers in the Arctic. The irrational competition built into the colonial capitalist system has also contributed to the so-called supply chain disruption, preventing the efficient movement of commodities from sellers to buyers throughout the world. In fact, goods are characterized as commodities precisely because they are not produced for the benefit of the people, but for profit. They are produced for the market. Free market economy, as defenders of the colonial mode of production proudly refer to it. Every corporation in every colonialist capitalist country is in competition with every other country or corporation. There can be no planning to make production beneficial to the people. Anarchy is a signature feature of the colonial capitalist economic system, of the colonial mode of production. Crisis is built into the system of market production. The colonial mode of production functions on a fault line of colonialism that guarantees permanent crisis. This is the crisis of imperialism, of the colonial mode of production that our party is focusing on deepening. Indeed, the liberation and redemption of Africa and Africans that our party is enabling globally are the most important ingredients to the death of a social system based on slavery and the basis for the emergence of a new world of free and liberated people with a free and liberated economy under the leadership of our party and the workers of the world. Everything that has been mentioned up to this point, from the climate crisis to the various machinations of existing or emerging powers, rely on the colonial mode of production for its being. This is a colonial capitalist world order, an imperialist created and nourished world order. Every contradiction that occurs within this colonial world order can be overcome only by a relentless assault on colonial capitalism itself, under the leadership of our party that was created for that purpose. This gives greater urgency at this critical time for all our work to build and expand the reach of our party, to recruit into the dynamic process of party organization that can only conclude in victory in the total liberation and unification of Africa and African people. The liberation and redemption of African people in our motherland under the leadership of the African working class, selfishly organized in the interests of Africa and the African working class.
Let's give the chairman a round of applause for that incredible political report.
We're
gonna take a we're gonna take a 45-minute lunch break. So please be back in your seats at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Oh, we missed Central, 12:30 Central, 1:30 Eastern, 6:30 p.m. General, and 8:30 Central African Time. Uhuru, comrades, thank you.
Uhuru.